My name is Rehan Aberatna. I am the executive director of that center. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all today and to introduce our speaker, my friend and my long time ago classmate in law school, Dr. Adam Lebovitz. Dr. Lebovitz is the WYNG Research Fellow in Political Theory and Philosophy at Trinity Hall, Cambridge. He holds a PhD as well as a JD from Harvard. His area of specialization is the constitutional histories and theories of the late 18th century, particularly as they manifested during the so-called Age of Revolution. His first book, titled Colossus, Constitutional Theory in America and France, 1776 to 1799, is under contract with Harvard University Press. So Adam is going to speak for about 45 minutes. We are then going to have a Q&A session. If you have questions, I encourage you to send them to me via the chat function, and I will then read them out to Adam when the time comes. Okay, so please send them to me for me to then read out to Adam. Once again, welcome everyone. Thanks very much to Adam for doing this, and let me turn over to you.
Hi, is this good? Am I unmuted? Still not so tech savvy. Thank you everyone for coming out for what must be evening for you, early morning for me in the UK. It's a pleasure to be here. Very grateful to Rehan for the invitation. And as I think the flyer will have advertised, I'll be speaking about some of the themes that I treat in the book, which is currently in preparation, which, as Rehan said, is titled Colossus, Constitutional Theory in America and France, 1776 to 1799. And today, I'll be speaking about one particular episode that comprises this sort of wider story that I'm trying to tell, or trying to supplement stories that others have told over the years about the Age of Revolution as an age of constitution making, obviously in America and France, but I'll be talking as well about some of the experiences in the so-called small republics. I'll be talking a little bit about the Dutch United Provinces and the Republic of Geneva, and I think that's probably enough previewing, so I'm going to try to share my screen and get into the presentation. Is this work? Good, okay. So, as I mentioned, there is a wider project with a wider scope with lots of themes and issues that I won't be discussing today. But the overall project looks at the end of the 18th century, as is well known, as you will obviously know about, as an age of constitution making, as an age of revolutionary and republican constitution making. It's the birth, really, with a sort of minor exception in the 17th century during the English Revolution, of the Republican written constitution comes out of this era. And so it seems like a decent bet that if we want to understand some of the, obviously, the benefits, but something that people are thinking more about today, some of the pathologies that attend the practice of republics with written constitutions, which constrain lawmakers in various ways and empower them in other ways, it might be productive to return to this era, and this is what I do. And so in this project, I look at different moments of constitution making in, at times, great detail. First in America and the American states between 1776 to 1780, where there's a great controversy. There's an enormous debate that happens across the 13, or if we count Vermont, 14 colonies about how to write a constitution, how to arrange powers, how democratic it should be, issues that today are debated by legal scholars, like under the heading of constituent power, pouvoir constituant, are raised in a way for the first time, at least self-consciously for the first time in this era. And some of the key protagonists in this debate include John Adams, who's recognized very early on as one of the most serious and learned constitutional thinkers in Massachusetts. And in a very curious kind of way, Benjamin Franklin, although Franklin isn't engaged in the production of constitutional theory, being very engaged in other projects, and in addition, not really being in America very much at all, since he's in Britain for most of the 1760s and 1770s, before the American Revolution, and then immediately after goes to Paris, where he is for the entire duration of the American Revolution. But there's a group around Franklin which is quite radical in some ways and has very different ideas about the proper arrangement of powers. And to sort of simplify greatly, one of the key debates concerns how much power the executive should have, with John Adams favoring an executive who's very powerful, who indeed is explicitly modeled on the British Crown, and the circle around Franklin, and of course their adherents in other states, favoring a very weak multiple executive, sort of an executive by committee, and with the other key institutional question being legislative power, with very strong debates ensuing about bicameralism versus unicameralism. The Pennsylvania Constitution is unicameral. It's imitated in Vermont and in Georgia. Most other states have kinds of bicameral constitutions with certain variation between them. At any rate, there's this debate that takes place in America, and then what the book does is follows that debate as it, in a way, travels around the Atlantic world. And so in the French Revolution, for example, many of these same debates get repeated at different constitutional moments. In 1789, where there's an explicit debate between so-called Americanist and Anglo-man sides, sort of recreating self-consciously the same debate about should there be a king? If there's a king, how much power should he have? How much prerogative? Should there be two chambers of the legislative? Should one be hereditary? What should they represent? And so on. And then continuing at different constitutional moments in 1793, when they write their first Republican constitutions, and then 1795 with the Thermidorian bicameral constitution with a plural executive. And so what the book does is traces the ways that John Adams and Franklin leave this kind of impress on the constitutional thought of the Atlantic world. And then at the very end of the book, I explore how some of these ideas come back to America. In other words, it's not only a story of ideas radiating outward from America, but also French, what are called then French constitutional ideas about, well, a weak executive, a unicameral legislature, other kind of institutional features, come back to America as radicals mainly based in Philadelphia and led by, well, it's no coincidence, the grandson of Benjamin Franklin, a very important radical newspaper author, probably the most important newspaper author of the 1790s, named Benjamin Franklin Beach, start to promote the renovation of the American Constitution along French, what they call French, but of course they understand are sort of classically Philadelphia lines. So that's the sort of summary of the scope of the book. And now let's get into the talk for today, which is about, as I said, the 1780s and a series of different constitutional moments. And you'll see on your screen, hopefully, if this is being shared competently, two figures at different points in their career. So on the left, you see John Adams in a drawing done in 1782 when he was ambassador, really the first recognized ambassador America ever had, to the United Provinces, that is to say the Netherlands, that is to say, sometimes we say Holland, although that's only one of the 7 states comprising the United Provinces. The Dutch Constitution is awfully complicated, and thankfully I don't have to be an expert in it and won't be discussing too many of its intricate details today, though we'll have to get into a few. At any rate, John Adams is an ambassador. He goes to Paris in 1778, where he's meant to help with negotiations with Versailles. It turns out he's not very much needed there, but it's his first time outside of America when he makes this trip in 1778, and he's thrust into a new intellectual world, something that his time at sort of the provincial backwater of Harvard College had not prepared him for. He's sort of catching up, trying to learn French so he can participate in these discussions. He's meeting the most important, philosophers, Enlightenment thinkers of his day in Paris, and it sort of transforms his thought and also gives him a kind of competitive edge, because he now starts to think that he needs to promote his constitutional ideas, what he calls Massachusetts constitutional ideas, although there is not yet at this point a Massachusetts constitution, it having been rejected by voters in 1778, he will go back to Massachusetts in 1779, write the new Massachusetts Constitution, which will be accepted by the voters, ratified. It's the first popularly ratified constitution that we know of in the world. And then he will go back to Europe immediately after doing this, first to Paris, and then to the Netherlands, the United Provinces, where he will live in Amsterdam and The Hague until 1783, when he goes to Paris to negotiate the Treaty of Paris, ending the American Revolution officially. Now, that's all John Adams. That was a lot by way of introduction. On the right, you will see a figure who is probably less known to you. This is Jacques Pierre, and he's somewhat obscure today, except to specialists in the French Revolution, but he's a figure of extraordinary importance, I would say equal importance in many ways to John Adams in his own time and in his own revolution. Much later on, beyond the period that we'll be discussing, in 1792 and 93, he is in some ways the most powerful and most important figure in the French Revolution. He'll be the leader of the so-called Girondin party, which will contend on the losing side with the Jacobins. And he will promote a vision of, well, it looks very attractive, I think, to many modern readers. It's an egalitarian, democratic Republican. He's very early and very passionate about the abolition of both the slave trade and slavery more generally. And he will become enmeshed in many kinds of international intellectual networks himself. Perhaps the most important are his friendship with Jeremy Bentham, who he meets in London in the early 1780s and continues a correspondence with for the rest of his life, for the rest of Rousseau's life, because Bentham's life will be much longer, and Thomas Paine, who he meets in Paris at the end of the 1780s, becomes very close with, is responsible for making Paine a citizen of France, bringing him to Paris from London, and then placing him on the Committee of Nine appointed to write a Republican constitution for France in 1792. So he's very close to Paine, as well as to Condorcet and many of the other, Madame Roland, many of the other figures in the so-called Girondin orbit. Now, looking ahead, we can see something of their future careers. On the left, we see John Adams in 1797, when he's just assumed the presidency of the United States, where he'll serve for one term before losing to Jefferson in 1800. And on the right, we see the fate of Rousseau, that is him on the left, being prepared for the guillotine, because he, along with much of the leadership of the Girondin faction in the convention, will be proscribed by Robespierre and the Jacobins in June 1793, and he will be sent to the scaffold after trial in October 1793. So this is their future trajectories, but of course, they're set in motion by some of the events that I will be discussing today. So the first thing to understand about the 1780s, and these are two quotes from the end of the 1780s, but they are indicative of the way that people were progressively thinking throughout this decade, is that it's a time of great expectations for Republican revolution. It's a time when, after the American triumph, after the American victory over the British becomes a kind of fait accompli, it's sort of understood that America is going to become an independent republic, whatever that means, and people vary about their assessments of its likely success, but they start to see momentum for Republican, or at least in a reformation of government, if not full Republican revolution, in lots of other places. And so people issue these great lists of where they expect the next American Revolution to occur. So you see on the left, John Adams speaking to Thomas Hollis in 1788, speaking of a great fermentation throughout all Europe upon the subject of government than was perhaps ever known at any former period. And here he names France, Holland, and Flanders, sort of parts of modern day Belgium, which will in fact have a revolution, a revolt against the Habsburg Empire in 1789, Holland, which we'll be discussing ad nauseum today, and of course France. This is early 1788, but by early 1787, it's very clear that something is going to happen in France. People aren't quite sure of the shape it will take. But it's understood that there will be a serious reformation. Now, very few people are thinking it will be a Republican reformation, but they are thinking, and this is lots of French elites across the board, including Baron Turgot, a very sort of influential French financial thinker and physiocrat economist, Jacques Pierre, sort of Swiss financier who comes to France and will also serve as Minister of Finance. People are thinking the powers of the king will be in some ways reduced. There will be a legislative power put in place, perhaps like the British Parliament, but there will be serious reforms that are going to occur. And you can see Richard Price, also very important Welsh political reformer, voicing the same sentiments in 1787 with roughly the same list. Holland, Brabant, which is also another way of talking about the Austrian Netherlands, France. It's a time when people expect revolution to spread across the world. So the first thing we'll be discussing, John Adams and the United Provinces. Here is a medal struck shortly after Adams arrives in the United Provinces, representing the friendship of two sister republics. And of course, the United Provinces are already a kind of republic at this time, even before the Revolt or Revolution that I'm going to discuss in a moment. There is a stadtholder, which is an executive figure with substantial executive prerogatives, who is hereditary, who comes from the House of Orange, who comes from one, but the most important of the provinces of the 7 provinces of the United Province, which is Holland. So Holland of great interest to Americans for many reasons, not the least of which is it's a confederated republic. It's 7 different independent states in some ways, which are united by a kind of national government, the States General, which is a kind of aristocratic legislative chamber, with the stadtholder, who is a hereditary executive figure responsible for overseeing military affairs and some forms of domestic peacekeeping. But it is a republic. I mean, it's at least everyone in the era talks about it as a republic. And so this medal, which is very striking, is struck in 1781 to mark America. America is on the right with the Native American headdress. It's the typical way of representing the American Republic at this time in Europe. And then the Dutch on the left with the traditional sort of Roman-derived costume. This is a plaque in The Hague where John Adams will go after spending some time in Amsterdam. He'll be back and forth between the two, but marking the spot of what is, again, as I said, the first actual recognized American embassy. The sort of missions previously, for example, Franklin's mission to France, were not recognized as official embassies. They're sort of necessarily informal. Franklin is a minister plenipotentiary, but France does not give him the full accreditation of an ambassador because that's too legally complicated. So let's talk a little bit about the Dutch, what's called the Dutch Patriot Revolt, and some of its sources. You see a representation on the left of it. This is meant to be a sort of Dutch Republican. And so we can see some of the features that, are sort of thought by the royalists, not the royalists, but the Orangist side, the Prince of Orange, the stadtholder, to be characteristic of these Dutch patriots. They called themselves patriots after it's the name that the Dutch gave themselves in the 17th century in their uprising against Spain. So we can see that he's treading on a Bible, first of all. They were in many ways sort of religious reformers and are sort of caricatured as anti-religious. He's wearing, the resolution is too poor, but he's made up of pamphlets from Olden Barnevelt, who is, a very important sort of figure in the Dutch, again, the Dutch revolt against the Spanish in the previous century. And he is treading on an orange branch with his other foot, which is not particularly subtle, but you sort of get the point here. And he's carrying a dagger, so he's meant to look sort of menacing. So the Dutch Patriot Revolt happens for a series of complicated reasons, which I'll do my best to summarize briefly right now. Essentially, the Dutch Republic, which was extremely powerful in the 17th century, has by this point gone into a kind of terminal decline. It is decreasing in power. It's been kicked out of, for example, its colony in New Amsterdam has been taken over by the British and renamed. the Dutch still have lots of colonies in the East and West, what are called the East and West Indies, but they're gradually losing their grip on those colonies. The British are sort of circling them hungrily, and they've also become quite subservient to the British. There's a connection between the British and House of Orange sort of ruling authorities, of course, because the British dynasty, the ruling dynasty, had come, as you'll remember, during the glorious revolution, so-called, from Holland, had come from the House of Orange. And so there's this connection. The stadtholder at this time, William V, is married to a Prussian princess. And so there are these more powerful states that are sort of, gradually turning the Dutch Republic into a kind of client state. And the American Revolution very much upsets this equilibrium. The Dutch, especially the Dutch merchant elite, are very much resentful of the British, and so we're starting to cheer on the American cause because they don't like that they've become effectively a British client state. Some of the Dutch colonies are running contraband to the United States, which the British are very angry about and are sort of telling their ambassador, you need to get these people in order, you need to collect them. And this sort of starts to issue in resentment against the stadtholder, who's seen as the sort of linchpin of Dutch subservience to the British. He's seen as sort of their bagman in the United Provinces. And so as they're getting more and more enthusiastic about the American Revolution, they're getting less and less enthusiastic about the rule of the stadtholder. The stadtholder had been overthrown, the office had been overthrown at various points in the 17th and early 18th century. And so they start to think, well, maybe we ought to do this again. And maybe we ought to clip his wings and sort of elevate the power of the States General. Or maybe, this is the most radical wing of Dutch Republicans, maybe we ought to do without a stadtholder altogether. And so these are the kinds of arguments that are taking place. Eventually things will kick off when the States General force through a measure declaring armed neutrality in the war between the British and the Americans, meaning that the Dutch assert that they're able to travel with their ships and supply both sides, and nobody had better try to blockade us or intercept our ships on either side, which infuriates the British to no end. This leads to the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, which the British say, okay, well, then you're violating the terms of our treaty. We're going to go to war. This war goes very badly for the Dutch, but this means that it goes even worse for the stadtholder, because as the Dutch are being militarily defeated all over the world in both the East and West Indies, the stadtholder, who's the primary military executive, the kind of commander-in-chief, gets a lot of the blame. And he also gets blame for, well, the reason we lost this war is that you've turned us into this weak client state of the British. And so this issues in a revolt, which really gets going in 1781, which is, as I said, often called the Dutch Patriot Revolt. And it's a series of local revolts in different states. And so the actual battles are happening at different times as the Patriot forces, who are backed by wealthy merchants primarily, start to resist the stadtholder and his power in different cities, Amsterdam at one point, Utrecht at another. This will continue until 1787, when, with the sort of two sides at a kind of stalemate, it will be resolved by an invasion of Prussian forces. The Prussian princess, the sister of the Prussian emperor, being the wife of the stadtholder. And so there's this close connection there. Now, what we're looking at here on the screen is a collection of American constitutions rendered into Dutch in 1781. And you can see on the left that it's dedicated, you don't have to have much Dutch to see this, to John Adams. And this is very important because as soon as John Adams arrives in the United Provinces, he immediately sets about in undermining the government of the stadtholder. Of course, this is his job as an ambassador, is to turn the government away from the British and towards a recognition of the Americans. He's also trying to secure a large loan. It's still sort of a center of banking, Holland at this time. And he's not only interested in executing his task as an ambassador, but he's also interested in propagating his constitutional ideas. And in particular, he wants to make sure that everyone knows about the Massachusetts Constitution, because there have been collections. There's an important French language collection of American constitutions executed by the Duc de la Rochefoucauld in 1778. But it doesn't include the Massachusetts Constitution, which hasn't yet been written, which frustrates America to no end. And so in Europe, they're all talking about how amazing the Pennsylvania Constitution is. And John Adams very much wants to get his own handiwork into the mix with, as I said, its more powerful governor with more prerogative, its strong bicameralism, its multiple veto points, and so on. And so he makes sure, for example, that it's included in this Dutch collection. There's also a French language connection, which is also published. There's a lot of French and Francophone intellectual life in Holland, in the Netherlands at this time. John Adams doesn't really ever get a great handle on Dutch, and so mainly is speaking English and French. But you can see, at any rate, that his efforts to propagate his own ideas, his own constitutional mottos, are bearing some fruit. Now, they're also bearing fruit in this extract from a very important and very, sort of lengthy text on constitutional theory, which is published in the Netherlands around this time, called the Grondwettige Herstelling, which means constitutional restoration. And it's the sort of central Dutch Patriot text about constitutional theory, about what exactly they're envisioning. It's a moderate program. They don't want to get rid of the stadtholder, as I'll explain in more detail a little later, that getting rid of the stadtholder is not something John Adams ever would have been interested in himself, and he certainly didn't have a problem with hereditary authority in a republic. But you can see from this extract from the Grondwettige Herstelling that they're not only thinking about America as a model, but they're thinking about Massachusetts in particular. Because Adams is sort of promoting the idea of Massachusetts as the ideal Republican constitution, and it's bearing fruit here. I mean, you can see that they're talking specifically about the Massachusetts Constitution, and what they take away from it is this could be a model for our, the more constrained stadtholder that we kind of imagine. And by the way, they say at the end of the quote, the Massachusetts governor is even afforded privileges that would not be harmful in a person who alternates each year, but could become so in a single stadtholder. Now, my translation is a bit awkward here, but really what they're trying to say is he has more power in some ways than the stadtholder, than this hereditary commander-in-chief. But that's okay because it's not as dangerous if there's rotation. So one thing they're thinking about is, well, if he wasn't hereditary, or if he rotated, or if he was subject to public checks, democratic checks of various kinds, Republican checks at least, maybe these great powers wouldn't be a bad thing at all. So they're very much thinking along Adams' lines, and it's no surprise. We don't know quite who wrote this text, but one candidate is Antoine-Marie Cerissier. He's a sort of French-Dutch journalist who appears to have had something to do with this text, and he's very close with Adams. They're in the same intellectual orbit. They're exchanging letters on constitutional theory, on promoting Adams' work. So it's no accident that Adams is showing up in this text. And Adams himself is also, by the same token, being influenced by what he sees in the Dutch Republic, as indeed are many Americans in the founding era. And so you can see in this long quote that when he says, this is in September, October 1786, he's on the verge of writing what will become in some ways his masterwork, his sort of 3-volume defense of the constitutions of government of the United States of America, which is written in some ways to influence what's going on in France, in some ways to influence what's going on in America, because they're both having kind of simultaneous constitutional moments. But it's also written for these other republics, these other Republican moments throughout Europe in the 1780s, one being the Netherlands. And indeed, he says explicitly in a letter to his son-in-law that it's inspired by a dream that he had. I fell into a deep sleep and had a long dream. I thought about the natural principles of government that had taken so deep root in revolutions in America, Ireland, and Holland, but whether there might not be a danger that innovations might not be made, which would require other changes, and so he's thinking about himself as a kind of legislator, like his friend, the Abbé de Mably, sort of great constitutional thinker who he's also in correspondence with in this era, Plato. But, you get the sense from this that both Adams is thinking of an arc of revolution traversing not the whole world, obviously, but the Atlantic world. I mean, really what we mean is Western Europe and North America. But there's this expectation of more revolutions to come. And he thinks a text like his, which will promote a triple balance of power, that is to say, legislative power shared between an upper chamber, a lower chamber, and an executive with a veto, sort of standard in some ways chapter and verse American constitutional theory today, although it's quite controversial at the time that he's writing it. But he's thinking that he needs to propagate this in part because of what he's seeing in Holland, where he spent a lot of time and where he briefly goes back to visit in 1786. So as I said, the Dutch revolt does not end well. This is a print from 1786 on the left, which is called The Patriot on His Deathbed, giving you a sort of sense of the times. On the right is a caricature of a Dutch, patriot soldier. It's cut off in a kind of unfortunate way, but if you could see the full drawing, he's standing on a hot stove. And this is from 1787, and the thought is that things are becoming very hot. Things are becoming very difficult for Dutch patriots. Their military situation is deteriorating slightly, and eventually, as I said, in 1787, Prussian armies will sweep in. They'll just say enough is enough. They will sweep into the United Provinces, restore the Stadtholder in The Hague, and put a stop to the Dutch Patriot Republic, although, of course, this will be only temporary because another army will enter Amsterdam and The Hague in 1795. It will be a French Republican army, and they will have very different ideas about constitutional order. As I said, there is an impress left on American constitutionalism as well from observations of the Dutch Republic. And I've sort of given you 3 quotations here, which each take a kind of different position on what America and American constitutionalism might productively learn from the experience of Holland. And so I won't read these quotes to you, but I'll briefly sort of go through each of them. So the first, Alexander Hamilton, writing in The Continentalist, a pamphlet that he puts out in 1781, characteristically is thinking about executive power. He's thinking about the way that the 14 colonies could be productively united. And he has sort of very interesting kind of constitutional theory of the kind that will reappear in the Federalist Papers about the function that an executive, a singular executive, and this is still extremely controversial. America at this point has nothing like this. It's controversial enough when they appoint sort of heads of individual departments, a War Department, a Finance Department around this time. But he's saying, well, if you had a singular executive like they have in the Netherlands, on the one hand, they could impose order from top down. On the other hand, it might also unite the Confederation because everyone is going to be kind of wary of this guy. And so that will be another point binding the different parts of the Confederation together. John Adams, I think characteristically, is actually very skeptical of the possibilities of Republican reform. He'll become more skeptical of this kind of thing as time goes on. But he basically thinks that the Dutch Constitution is too poorly balanced. The Stadtholder has too much power or the aristocratic States General have too much power, but they haven't arrived at a correct equilibrium. And so, as he says, it's a warning to the United States. And then finally, we see Thomas Jefferson very concerned about what Holland tells us about the prospects of America going forward. This is a letter that he writes immediately after reading the U.S. Constitution, the draft, for the first time. It's just been given to him by, again, Adams' son-in-law, William Stephen Smith, because Jefferson famously is in Paris as Franklin's successor. And what he says is, what we have lately read in the history of Holland in the chapter on the Stadtholder would have sufficed to set me against a chief magistrate eligible for a long duration if I had ever been disposed towards one. Our convention has been too much impressed by the insurrection in Massachusetts, that is to say, Shays' Rebellion, and they are setting up a kite to keep the hen yard in order. Now, the way of decoding this, the way of understanding what's going on, is that he's just read about the Article 2 executive, the presidency, and he's saying this is going to be a disaster. It looks way too much like the Stadtholder. Yes, it's not hereditary, but there's no term limit on how many times a president can serve. The term limit on presidents being, of course, a 20th century innovation. And so there's no reason why we shouldn't expect them to serve life terms, and this is going to create constitutional pathologies down the line. Now I'll talk about the second part of what I want to talk about in this lecture on constitution making in the 1780s, which is Rousseau. And I'll talk briefly, I hope, about his experiences in two places, Geneva and the United States, and what that means for the constitutional theories that he would develop, as I said, as he becomes a very important leader of the French Revolution, and indeed constitutional theorist. I mean, theorist in the same way that Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Adams are. We can think of Rousseau in similar terms. So the Geneva Revolution of 1782 is another funny example of revolution, Republican revolution, because once again, it happens in a republic. Now, I'm not going to get into all of the complicated background, but there is an enormous dispute in Geneva about who really belongs, who has full membership in the state. And so there are all these tiers of citizenship. There are the very powerful oligarchical sort of aristocrats of the city who have lived in the city forever, who sort of control everything. They run an organ called the Small Council, the Petit Conseil, which has the lion's share of executive authority. They're the only ones who can serve in office. There's another class of wealthy merchants called burghers who are allowed to vote for the Grand Conseil. That's a sort of bigger executive-style chamber, but they don't have the right to serve in office. And then there are lots of people below them called habitants, natifs, etc., who have lived in the city forever, that is to say generations and generations, but don't have any real right to either participate or serve in office. And, you know, some of them are restricted in the professions that they can pursue. Some of them are quite wealthy and so really resent being excluded from power. And so it's a very unstable situation. There had been a kind of temporary truce between these forces arranged in 1768. Rousseau, who is, of course, Genevan and is very engaged in these debates, is blamed for sort of spurring on the reformist called the représentant side of the dispute. But they arrive at a kind of truce in 1768. But like many truces, it's unstable. The aristocratic side, formerly called the négatif, now in 1782, they call themselves, quite notably, the constitutionnel, resent having had to make this compromise, and they kind of want to claw some of those powers back. Whereas the other forces on the représentant side are saying, well, we need more reform. There's lots of people who still can't participate in the Republic. And so Rousseau gets involved. He is already a reforming, crusading journalist by 1779. He is sort of traveling all over France. But he gets the opportunity in 1782 to visit Geneva in a brief period where the représentant side has kicked out the sort of oligarchs, has taken over the city, and are trying to rewrite the constitution to expand the franchise, expand membership. And so one of his, they haven't met yet, but there's a Genevan, very important Genevan lawyer and literary figure named François Divonnois, who is in fact the editor of Rousseau's collected papers at this time, who invites Rousseau. He says, come to Geneva, see what we're doing here. I really admire, another one of your work, your theory on criminal law. So come see what's going on. And so Rousseau, at the instigation of the représentant side, in the very short-lived period, and it's only about 6 months that these forces are in power before a French army will come into Geneva, take over, restore the constitutionnel, that is to say, the oligarchs. But in this brief period, Rousseau starts to, he writes in defense of the représentant cause. And the form, and you can see on the left, the form that this takes is extremely curious because it's a pamphlet called The Philadelphian at Geneva, Letters of an American on the last, the late revolution in Geneva and its new constitution. Now, Rousseau is not American. He's never been to America. But it's very notable, I think, that he's assuming this persona of an American. And it's notable because, as we've seen, it's America and the American example that's inspiring, a lot of these reformist, revolutionary movements. France. And so he thinks he'll sound more credible if he can sort of disguise who he really is and assume this sort of invented character of an American, not just an American, by the way, a Philadelphian. We've talked a little bit about how Philadelphia is associated with the more radical end of constitution making in America, that is to say, more populist, more unicameral, weaker executive. Rousseau is someone who will be very concerned about excessive executive power and always wants to sort of keep it in check. And so, as you can see at the end of this, and if you look at the footnote, which I've also included, this is Rousseau's footnote, when he's talking, in sort of a grand style about the right of all people to revolt, and, when we Americans were in revolt against Parliament and, our natural right of self-defense, he says, read the Constitution of Pennsylvania, which is already being read in France and being well received, because it's going to lay all of this out, all of this stuff about natural rights. I can't say it better than they've already said it. Now, I'm going to argue, part of my argument is that the experience that Rousseau has in Geneva, and again, he's there for only a few months. French forces enter in late June, early July, 1782, and all of Duvernois, all of Rousseau's friends will leave. Rousseau will leave as well, fleeing ahead of the armies. But Rousseau meets someone very important there, which is someone named Etienne de Clavière, who is a very important financier, economic thinker, who is very important to Rousseau for personal reasons. Rousseau is completely broke, and he needs someone very rich to help him pay off his debts, and that turns out to be Clavière. And then they start writing together because they're both living in France at this point, Clavière now being in exile from Geneva, and they are thinking about how to reform the French Constitution along, it must be said, Genevan lines, or using some of the things that they've learned in Geneva. And there's wonderful work done, I should say, by the intellectual historian Richard Watmore, who has written 2 great books about Geneva and the way that what happens in Geneva ramifies into the French Revolution. But for our purposes, I think what's important to understand is that this continues to exercise Rousseau. What he sees in Geneva continues to concern him, and it sort of is giving him lessons about how to correctly make a revolution and reform a constitution. And so we see, one lesson that he claims to have learned in the pamphlet that he'll put out in 1787, Point de banqueroute, that is to say, no bankruptcy, is that the Genevans were too accommodating to moderate aristocratic forces. They didn't do what they should have done, which is completely evict them from power. They were too moderate for their own good, and this is what overturned their revolution. Well, I'm not going to get into everything that happens in the French Revolution, but suffice to say, this is a lesson that Rousseau and others will very much take to heart. And then in his very important constitutional text of 1789, April 1789, so, 3 months before the fall of the Bastille and before the revolution really kicks into high gear, we see this great passage on, in some ways, constitutional theory, showing us what Rousseau thinks he has learned from the Genevan experience, from his short time observing it there. And one of the things he's worried about is that, the executive power, anytime you have an executive power, and by executive he really means not just what we would think of like a president, but sort of he's thinking about this division, which will become very important in the French Revolution, to French revolutionary constitutional theory, between pouvoir constitué and pouvoir constituant, right? So the constituent power and the constituted powers. And he's saying that, there's this great danger because the pouvoir constituant, the people, the sovereign power of the people, is always at a disadvantage because the government itself is sort of always doing things, it's always in motion. But if we look to the Genevan experience, we really see, we really see the danger of this because, the Genevans really, the Genevan aristocracy really had a backwards view of sovereignty. They tried to claim that the people weren't sovereign, but they themselves were sort of sovereign by long constitutional tradition. They tried to sort of buy the people off by giving them rights. They tried to do everything they could to take away the natural right of the people, the Genevan people, all of them, the natifs, the habitants, as well as the people with formal sort of legal rights under the Constitution, to make their own constitution, to set the terms of what the government would be, to effectively be the central sovereign power in the state. And this is, once again, a lesson which comes from Rousseau, right? This division between sovereign power and government power is straight from the social contract, as well as Rousseau's writings on Geneva. And it will become very important as well in the French Revolution, very important to Rousseau and to what will be called Girondin constitutional theory more generally, which we see also reflected in the writings of Condorcet and in Thomas Paine. And then Rousseau will also make a voyage to America. Here he is on the left with George Washington. In 1788, he gets money from Etienne Clavière to travel through America to learn, as he says in the preface to this work, lessons about constitution making. And the reason that he's doing this is that everyone expects a constitutional revolution in France. They don't necessarily expect that it will be Republican, but they understand, they expect that there's going to be serious reforms made, and that now is the time to start studying models. And so Rousseau does exactly this. He plans a year-long trip in North America, but it's cut short by events in France, which are moving so fast that after 6 months, he sort of decides, he makes an executive decision himself to get out of there, get back to France so he can participate in the strum of events. And so in his comments on America as well, we see, this is from 1783, but he's already thinking about America as under threat, as the American Constitution, well, it hasn't yet been made, but as the American Republic is something which is somewhat fragile, which is somewhat in danger. And, as he says in this quote, these debates prove that the political constitution of America is not yet solidly established. The limits of executive power might be too restricted or not yet well fixed. The machine is in need of certain springs, and those that currently exist are not sufficient. So his point is America is going to need a more overarching constitutional order. On the left, you see a coin struck in 1786 in New York. That is Latin for New York. So you can see a lot going on here too in the neo-Romanism, the neoclassicism of the American Republic as it's starting to think about itself in this pre-constitutional period. Here's another long quote. I won't read the entire thing. It's from the same work from 1783. But he's arguing, look, America needs to think about a comprehensive constitutional order, what he calls here a code of civil and criminal laws, but, a constitutional order. And, one of the main reasons is that America is this key influence on constitution making in the rest of Europe. And so everyone else is looking to America for guidance on what a properly reformed or even Republican constitution might look like. And for that reason, America has to take the task very seriously. And indeed, one of the things Rousseau will argue is that America shouldn't try to write its constitution itself because the stakes are too high, but it should assemble a panel of great philosophers. He names Condorcet, he names the Abbé de Mably, John Adams, of course. I mean, Americans can participate as well, but this is serious business because when America makes its constitution, it is going to effectively be legislating for the entire world. He will go visit John Adams, although the way that he visits John Adams, and this is the only time that they meet, is very curious. He claims that it takes place on this trip in 1788 in Braintree. Adams, of course, was not living in Braintree in 1788. He had moved, if you've ever been to Adams National Park, just down the road to his new house. Braintree, which is extremely rustic, was not going to do for John and especially, it should be said, Abigail Adams, after having lived in great splendor in Paris, in London for many years. So this is their new house, which is a bit grander, called Peacefield. But John Adams makes very clear in his letters that he and Rousseau did not meet on Rousseau's trip to America, that they met before Rousseau went to America in 1787 in London when sort of Rousseau was en route, when Adams was finishing his term as America's ambassador to London. But what Rousseau says, and they both agree on the details of their meeting, and it's the only meeting of the two men, so I think that this is sort of where we'll conclude is Rousseau and Adams thinking about each other, is Rousseau says, it was wonderful to meet Adams. I won't read the whole quote, but he says it was wonderful to meet Adams. He had the dignity you know, it was like meeting one of the great Roman Republicans, Cincinnatus, you know, meeting a great Roman general. He was surrounded by that kind of dignity. But Rousseau says, I was very disappointed by what he said, because I asked him about the oncoming and the upcoming, I should be said, French Revolution. And remember, this is probably happening in 1787, but already, you know, the French Revolution did not explode out of nowhere. It's something that everyone is already thinking about by this point. And he says, Adams told me something very curious, which is that he did not think that we would be able to successfully reclaim our liberties, even, Rousseau says, even the liberties enjoyed by England. Because Rousseau at this point is already thinking England is not a good model for liberty, that they enjoy a very sort of half liberty, you know, they're only sort of half free. Of course, Rousseau said they weren't free at all, so in some ways that's an improvement. But he says, you know, it's very funny that Adams says this. When Rousseau publishes his Nouveau Voyage en Amérique in 1788, the Voyages in 1788, but he doesn't publish this until 1791. He drops a footnote to his conversation with Adams, where Adams says, I don't think France is going to successfully make a revolution. I don't think they're going to successfully establish liberty. And he drops a footnote in 1791, which is very smug, which says, well, events have proven how wrong he was. Well, that will be a matter of some debate. Here we see a caricature of Rousseau in the Jacobin Club. Rousseau will be an extraordinarily important Jacobin in 1791-92 until he's kicked out of the Jacobin Club in 92. And he'll, of course, be kicked out of the convention and everything else in 1793. But we have two quotes here from the thick of the French Revolution, showing the very different attitudes that these men are starting to take towards one another as they realize that they are on different trajectories, different ideological trajectories. Rousseau in 1788 or 87 thinks Adams is going to be his best friend, his greatest ideological ally, and he's sort of shocked to see that he's not at all. But of course, in some ways, he hasn't been reading Adams very carefully. So on the left, we have a quote from, we can't be sure that it's from Rousseau, but it's from Rousseau's newspaper, very important newspaper, Le Patriot Français, which is talking about it's taking some shots at a man named Jacques Vincent Delacroix, who is not important for our speech, but for today's talk. But Delacroix is the editor of the French edition of John Adams' Defense of the Constitutions of America, which is published in France in 1792. And he's believed to be the translator. As it turns out, he's not actually the translator. For our purposes, that doesn't matter. He is the editor. His name's on the title page. But he says, well, Delacroix, of course he would say this, and this other unrelated point, because he was the one who translated John Adams, that tiresome panegyrist of bicameralism, you know, and he can't think about constitutionalism except in terms of a balance of powers. Balanced powers, checks and balances, which is something the French Revolution, not just the Jacobins, I mean, the hardcore Jacobins, but also Rousseau, have very much moved away from this idea of balance. And we can talk about that in the Q&A, why that's completely rejected. But John Adams is no longer, John Adams was Cincinnatus 4 years ago, or really in a text Rousseau published just the year before. Now he is that tiresome panegyrist of bicameralism. Adams, for his own part, thinks no higher of Rousseau. You know, as he says in a letter to Abigail in January, when Rousseau is probably the most powerful figure in the French Revolution, we shall see in a few months the new French Constitution, which is being written by a committee, including Rousseau, which may last 12 months, but probably not more than 6. Robespierre and Marat, with their Jacobin supporters, I suspect will overthrow the fabric which Condorcet, Paine, and Rousseau will erect. And then we shall see what in their turn they will produce. Well, Adams wasn't always perfectly prescient, but that is exactly on the money. The Republican Constitution written by Condorcet with some input, it's unclear to what extent, by Rousseau and Condorcet, is never implemented. It's never approved by the convention. The Girondin leadership is proscribed. The Jacobins will then take their constitutional draft, kind of erase the Girondin name, add their own name to it. They'll make some other changes, a few of which are important, most of which aren't. But the Girondin Constitution, in the form they write it, never takes power, is never realized. And the Girondins themselves don't live to see anything like their constitution implemented. So John Adams exactly correct here. And this is the last slide, so this is where I'm ending the talk. But on the left, we see a caricature from 1815 from a text called the Dictionnaire de Girouette, which is effectively the dictionary of weather vanes or weathercocks. And a weather vane or a weathercock is what people during and then after 1815, so right after the Revolution, called those men who sort of ended up on every side, whatever side was in power. They found a way to make their way to that side, support that side. The Abbé Sieyès is one example of this. Talleyrand, the foreign minister, is another good example of this, but their numbers are legion. But what I like about this caricature is that it not only shows people switching sides politically, but it shows, again, unfortunately, I couldn't get a better resolution image than this, but it shows a windmill or a girouette, in a sense, of constitutions, because the French Republic will have this many constitutions. I mean, we see the 1814 Charter, when Napoleon leaves before he comes back and then is finally defeated at Waterloo. The Jacobin Constitution, the 1791 Constitution, the 1799 Constitution. They have Le Mercier's sci-fi text, the year 2440, which is a famous utopian text from the end of the 18th century, thrown in for good measure. But what we see is that there's just this revolving door of not just regimes or political factions, but constitutions, written constitutions, which is the way that power is expressed. So this is a drawing on the left from 1815, and on the right, we have a quote from John Adams, who is consistent in some ways, but his attitude will harden towards Republican revolution, his skepticism towards written constitutions as some vehicle that's going to bring people freedom. He'll very much move away from that. He always thought that you couldn't just drop a constitution on a society and expect that that would make a society free. He always thought it has to match the culture and the mores and so on. But this is about as harsh as he would ever be on the subject of constitution making, and I think it's as good a place as any to end. Was it probable, he's writing to his friend James Lloyd, was it possible that such a plan of Miranda's, now Miranda, another fascinating figure in the Atlantic world, he's a general who was trying to liberate South America from Spanish rule, sort of a proto-Bolivar in some ways. He is a general during the French Revolution, where he becomes friends with Thomas Paine. Anyway, that's a footnote. A plan of Miranda's of a free government and a confederation of free governments should be introduced and established among such a people, well, he means South America, over that vast continent or any part of it. It appeared to me more extravagant than the schemes of Condorcet and Brissot to establish a democracy in France, schemes which had always appeared to me as absurd as similar plans would be to establish democracies among the beasts, birds, or fishes. Well, Adams is fairly consistent, as we've seen from his exchange with Rousseau, about the dim prospects of a free Republican society in France. I mean, that is a point he's fairly consistent on. But we see that his attitude has hardened. I think that he's cautiously skeptical in 1787 and 1788. And by 1815, it's a self-evident absurdity. And he's also thinking, and this is also interesting, I think, he continues to think about his old antagonists, Condorcet and Brissot. I mean, they're not top of mind for most Americans at this time, but Adams, who had lived through not only the 1790s, where he's president and is dealing with the French Republic, but I think more crucially, the 1780s, sort of this formative period where Condorcet, Brissot, and Adams himself are sort of crystallizing their ideas about constitution making and what makes for a free Republican society. It's sort of the crucible from which all of that emerges. And so for that reason, very much worth our attention. And that's the end of my talk, and I will now stop sharing my screen.
Great, thank you so much, Adam. What an amazing tour d'horizon of the entire sort of transatlantic kind of world at that time. And I think for many of us, at least for me, I was really not aware of the influence of the Dutch in particular on American constitution making, and I thought this was fascinating. So we can now move to a Q&A. If folks want to send me questions, they can. While they're doing that, I'll just take my moderator's prerogative and ask a question to begin with. And so in the paper that you circulated, I was very interested in the critical accounts of French thinkers of Adams. In particular, the idea that he had just kind of aped aspects of British constitutionalism without much thought. I took it that some of them even sort of accused him of being a royalist of sorts. And I also took it that he was, well, you said this, that he was deeply offended, especially by Turgot. And I was wondering why he was deeply offended. Was it just that he was kind of a prickly character and sort of took it personally because the Massachusetts Constitution was his baby? I sort of understood that he was an Anglophile, so it would be odd that perhaps he would be offended by that. Was it the royalist connotation? But I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, sort of what exactly those critiques were and why he took it so personally.
Thank you. So I think that we can go across every dimension there. It's one of those things that's just overdetermined. So the first thing we can say is that he is the type absolutely to take things personally. I mean, he is a prickly, he's described by people as a kind of melancholy character, or, if we're thinking in terms of, anatomy of melancholy, he's got like a certain kind of bile. He's just that kind of guy. He's extremely insecure. And those insecurities are intensified very much when he goes to France because he feels extremely provincial. He doesn't speak French, which is sort of table stakes for being able to participate in intellectual life in Europe. In the American colonies, it was never important. He learned Latin. He learned a little bit of Greek. He had English. I mean, that is an educated person at Harvard College, but he realizes how provincial he is when he goes to Europe, when he sees Franklin, very much at home there. He meets Turgot. In fact, the first thing he does when he gets to Paris in 1778, the very first thing he does, his first night in Paris, is go to a party at Turgot's house. So Turgot is someone he knows. So Adams very much wants to cut a figure in this society. I mean, he's insecure, and like a lot of people, he wants to make a name for himself, and he wants to do it intellectually. And he feels that he has intellectual powers, that he can just show them, what he can do. And so this is part of why he's so keen to propagate the Massachusetts Constitution is, what Rousseau would call, amour propre. I mean, he wants to do it in part because he thinks it's right. It's the right arrangement of powers. But, the New York Constitution is not so different. It's because he wrote it. It's his baby. So that's a lot of it. As far as Turgot, Turgot is not thinking about Adams when he writes this famous letter to Richard Price in 1778, critiquing the American constitutions. He hasn't, there is no Massachusetts Constitution to critique. He hasn't read Adams' Thoughts on Government. Adams' pamphlet, which begins as a letter, Thoughts on Government from 1776, is a key constitutional text. Really one of the most important produced after, sort of in the early revolutionary period. Its importance is in some ways up there with common sense, at least for constitutional affairs, because it will influence constitution making in New York, in North Carolina, in lots of other places. They're reading it as a blueprint. The only place Adams can't get a constitution patterned after it almost is Massachusetts, where it's, as I said, initially rejected. So, Turgot, in a sense, without knowing it, is critiquing Adams when he critiques some of these American state constitutions as being too British. Now, one reason, as you suggest, that this critique hits home is that it's true. Adams is extremely Anglophile. And as Eric Nelson, who's an intellectual historian at Harvard, I guess I should disclose who I studied with when I was at Harvard, has written in his really fantastic book, The Royalist Revolution, many of the men who made the revolution were royalists. And I mean this very explicitly. Both they believed in strong royal powers, much stronger than someone in Britain at the time would have believed in. And they also, some of them on the extremes, weren't averse to forms of royalism in America. And I think the most extreme two people that's true of are Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. Now, they will forever be sort of, refuting the charge that they're royalists in these sort of niggling ways. I didn't say that, didn't say that it should be hereditary necessarily. I didn't say it has to be royalist. I said it could be. They're anxious to push back because it's not a great look in the 1780s and thereafter. But they are royalists in a very broad, sort of accurate sense. And by the way, in Europe, when people are describing the American Constitution in the 1780s and 90s, when they're describing the presidency, it is not polemical when they call it a roi républicain, or a, sort of, they have, Adams boasts famously that the stadtholder himself says, "Vous avez-vous donné un roi sous le titre du président," words to that effect. You've given yourself a king under the title president. Adams is proud of that. So yeah, that's also part of why it's hitting home. Now, Adams also is sort of misunderstanding in some ways parts of Turgot's argument. I think he kind of takes what Turgot says and runs with it. I mean, he becomes obsessed with it in probably a way that's not accurately reflecting Turgot's critique. He puts Turgot in the title of the defense. I mean, the defense, the full title, or at least in the edition Adams could control, the second edition, when he could name it the way he wanted to, he names it A Refutation of Mr. Turgot's Principles in his letter to Richard Price. I mean, it's kind of insane. I mean, Turgot's letter is known, but it's not like, it's not like refuting Plato or something. So he's sort of obsessed. And then later on, and this is something I talk about a lot in the book in preparation, he becomes obsessed with Condorcet and refuting Condorcet. Condorcet is Turgot's sort of right-hand man until Turgot dies. Condorcet's constitutional theory is an expansion and a democratization in some ways of Turgot's constitutional theory, but clearly getting its bearings from Turgot. And so Adams, and if you go to the Boston Public Library, or indeed if you go to archive.org, where most of Adams' books are there digitized, you can see he has gone through text by Condorcet, including Condorcet's sketch on the progress of the human mind, however we're translating that, and the human spirit, and annotated it to all hell. I mean, every single page just full. And so he's obsessed with Condorcet. I think he sort of understands what Condorcet is about, and Condorcet too, by the way, it should be said, is writing texts in response to Adams. Condorcet's Letters of a Bourgeois from New Haven, once again in this great tradition of pretending that you're American to write a text on republicanism in Ancien Regime France, is also a direct, an indirect response, but clearly a response to John Adams. It's not direct because he doesn't cite Adams, but it is a response to the defense and similar texts like that. So sorry, that's a lot.
No, maybe it's terrific. Thank you. I'll just take this opportunity to somewhat unrelatedly plug the HBO miniseries John Adams, which does a terrific job depicting his insecurity in France.
I've never seen that, and I need to rectify that.
It's great. I mean, you can probably pick holes in some of the historical stuff, but it's enjoyable. So we have a lot of questions. Some are about kind of lessons for the future, which I'm just going to hold off on at the moment, and some are about things that you've said. So let me start with those. So a question from my colleague Chris Roberts, pertaining to the last slide in particular. When Adams refers to democracy here, is democracy something he would advocate at that point of time, or was he skeptical of that category as such? And then a kind of sort of related question, what were the general attitudes to democracy among the various thinkers on both sides of the Atlantic in the period you examined?
Yeah, thank you. So this is very much on my mind because I'm supposed to be writing an article on understandings of democracy in France and in the French Revolution. I think suffice to say that, there is a wonderful secondary literature on this. Robert Palmer, R.R. Palmer's The Age of the Democratic Revolution, which is a fantastic book. It was written in 1961, still holds up really well. And I think, by the way, my own work very much takes Palmer, his incredible synoptic work. I mean, sort of staggering. He goes to Russia, he goes to Poland, he goes everywhere, does a deep dive. And so Palmer has a great note about changing understandings of democracy in this period. It's not the last word on this stuff, but it's still very solid. I think basically democracy has only a negative valence until the 1780s in both America and France. I think that's the easiest way of answering it. At which point it starts to have a kind of positive valence, but only with the modifier Republican, or with democracy turned into a modifier. That is to say, we start to get this new phrase, the Democratic Republic, or Republican democracy, although now that I think about it, Democratic Republic is far more common. So democratic is turned into a modifier for republicanism. Now, one reason it's important to do this is you have states like Holland, Geneva, Venice. These are the famous San Marino. These are the famous republics of Europe. They're all in small states, by the way, but which have almost nothing to do with democracy. That is to say, there's almost nothing we would recognize as sort of popular power at any point. They're called republican because they divide up power between different bodies, but the people, although, sometimes very rich people, with a limited franchise can have a say on part of the government, but, you can see the stadtholder. I mean, it's this funny chimera of limited monarchy and then sort of aristocratic oligarchy and very minor, elements of voting. Geneva, it's a republic, but almost nobody can vote and a lot of power is transmitted hereditarily through families. So republic can mean all kinds of things in this period. Adams himself says a republic just means more than one person is in charge. That's the only sense we can make of republic. So Adams doesn't view democracy as dangerous if it's a modifier, if it's democratic republic. I think that he's on board with that, just as Condorcet, who may be either Condorcet or Mazet, Filippo Mazet, who's another one of these fabulous transatlantic characters of the period, an Italian who lives through the American Revolution, then spends the 1790s in Europe. Mazet actually might be the first to use the phrase. There's a lot of scholarship, but essentially Adams doesn't oppose democratic republicanism, but when you use democracy, the sense is still sort of direct participation by the people. Now, James Madison famously says in Federalist 10, the principle of our Constitution is the exclusion of the people, I'm forgetting the word, from any role. People are excluded from any role in public life, and that's sometimes taken to mean that Madison is some kind of oligarch. He's not, but what he means is that the people themselves aren't going to have any role apart from voting, which is a crucial caveat. Madison, like Hamilton, like all of these guys, like Adams, thinks voting, is going to be the basis of all legitimate order. But the question is, is it direct or indirect voting? I think they're very open to indirect we know they're very open to indirect kinds of schemes. No one really thinks the people themselves should be wielding power. But of course, Rousseau and Condorcet don't think that either, really, with the exception of primary assemblies, which are kind of local conventions. We can talk a little bit about that, but sort of one of the key divisions, of course, between the Girondin and the Jacobin sides is how much power, what role individual people who just kind of show up at a club meeting, at a riot, at a, whatever, how much power they should have in a state, and if democracy has anything to do with the people themselves actually commanding or actually wielding authority as opposed to being the substrate of power, voting, and then something happens to those votes. So Adams, democratic republicanism, roughly yes, although as we've seen, he's not averse to forms of hereditary power, but democracy in this way, no, he is using that as an epithet, and that's not uncommon in his era, either in France or America.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask you one more kind of theoretical question and then move to sort of more practical implications. So this is from Ryan Mitchell, also my colleague and who you know.
Yes.
What was the role for Adams or Brissot and others of pre-Rousseau theorists of sovereignty, such as Baudin or Hobbes?
They have read Hobbes, that's very clear. They are interested in Hobbes, I should say more on the French side than on the American side. I think that when Adams talks about Hobbes, it's almost always negative. And I think that that's usually true. I think there are exceptions. I think Hamilton might be an exception, actually. But I don't get the sense anyone on the American side is extremely conversant with Hobbes. It's different on the French side. They are. They've read Leviathan, especially those who can read English. Those who can't have spent time with de Quive. We know this because there is a summary of Hobbes. There's a summary of de Quive that appears in a journal edited by Condorcet in 1791 or 92, a very extensive summary where it's not at all a negative summary. I mean, they're saying, actually Hobbes is getting this or that right about religion especially, but also they can see what scholars today often insist on, which is the connection between Hobbes and Rousseau, right? That Rousseau is a kind of Hobbist, that he's sort of making tweaks to Hobbesian theory. Baudin is not a negative figure, I should say. I mean, I don't see a lot of references to Baudin. I've seen a few, though, and they're not necessarily all negative. I don't get the sense of a deep engagement, but maybe I just haven't seen the right texts. Hobbes is very much read in the French Revolution, though. Somewhat more by conservatives. Pierre Roederer, who is associated with a different wing than Rousseau, which is a sort of more moderate, more liberal wing, is doing a lot with Hobbes, citing Hobbes all the time, is translating De Quive. So Hobbes is being read in the French Revolution, and he is a figure of some importance. He's much less read in America, and indeed it's hard in America to pinpoint reading of Rousseau, which is tricky. I mean, of course, people have gone through and tallied up all the references, but it's not as extensive as you might think, considering that Americans are going to town on Rousseauvian practice, that is to say, differentiating between sovereignty and government, having constitutions ratified by the people. I mean, they're making all kinds of Rousseauvian moves, but it's very hard to prove that most of them have read much Rousseau. I mean, so Adams, for example, has Rousseau. He has him in translation, and he hasn't really annotated him much, which, having spent a lot of time with Adams' library, I think is a pretty good sign he hasn't read him very closely. So Baudin, no, not really. Some in the French Revolution. In America, not that I've seen at all, really. Hobbes, of course, he's been read. I do get the sense that he's left an impact on Hamilton. I think everyone else has read him, but sort of skeptically. They're both skeptical about the religion stuff, which is sort of very anti-clerical, anti-religious, and they're skeptical of the politics. I think he's still sort of viewed as a kind of tyrant. Brissot has made very careful study of Rousseau, and I think that, he begins life as a sort of Rousseauvian disciple, as so many intellectuals of the period have, and I think he is a Rousseauvian at Rousseau's most Hobbesian. That is to say, he's got articles from 1789 inveighing against crowd riots and crowd participation, as sort of, you've got these crowds roaming around Paris and taking things over and making the revolution do this or that, or making the government do this and that. And he's got a column where he says this confuses sovereignty and the multitude. I mean, he's taking stuff directly from Hobbes. Now, this is also stuff you can find in Rousseau, but Brissot is a Rousseauvian with a strong Hobbesian streak. And I don't know about Brissot, not that I remember, but people in Brissot's circle are making explicit study of Hobbes.
Terrific, thank you. So we have two questions that are sort of more practical in nature. So maybe I'll ask you both of them, since we're a little short on time, and you can answer one or both depending on how you feel. So question one from Conrad Chung. He says, U.S. society turns inwards in several periods in history. From your presentation, I realized this was not happening in the 1780s. I would like to ask, when did the enthusiastic cultural constitutional export stop from the US side, if ever? I think you can just constrain yourself to this period, not like all of US history. And a second question from Sandra. In your opinion, what lessons from this specific era can we apply now or in future constitutional moments in order to avoid mistakes, mischances that the protagonist did not see then?
Well, let me start with the first one. So yes, I think that, when I'm trying to explain, sort of in an elevator or whatever, properly socially distanced, of course, what the book is all about. I think one of the key things, just one of the most obvious facts in the founding era, which I think we forget about, is almost all of the founders, whatever we want to call them, spoke French and were very engaged in French intellectual life. Now, this is not, when we write the constitutional history of America, we tend not to do it with Francophone sources, but one of the things I want to argue, I'm not going to say the stupid thing we sometimes say about it, you can't do it without that. Of course you can. You can do very good work, as people have done, but it is an important part of the story. It's very hard to find a founder who did not have a very good grasp on at least reading French, and most of them could speak at a very high level. Actually, the best supposedly was Alexander Hamilton, who never went to France, but think, picked it up on the islands. I forget exactly where he's supposed to have gotten it, but French people who visited America said he spoke incredible, like native level French, but all down the line, right? Adams, Franklin, Madison, you know, all down the line. So it is a very international moment for America. This is no accident. It's a time when the American Republic is very interested in international law, with appearing in public as a kind of sovereign state. And so it has to look outwards. It does turn inward, but I don't think it does in the period that I study. That is to say, it doesn't at any point between 1776 and 1799. And really, it doesn't even if we advance the story to 1815, although I think after that it probably does quite a bit. I think there is still some influence happening on Latin America and Latin American constitution making in the sort of around the Bolivarian revolutions, but it doesn't turn inward at any point. And this is sort of what the book is about. And so when the French are writing the Thermidorian constitution, Americans in some ways are, you know, interested in influencing it. James Monroe, who is the American ambassador to Paris, writes a memo at the request of the French government about the American Constitution and how it works. I mean, at their request, so it's not quite the same evangelical fervor that we might see at other points in American history, but the French continue to be very interested in what's happening in America. And America, of course, is very interested in what's happening in France. As I said, there's a lot of debates in the 1790s when America is effectively in a kind of ideological civil war between French partisans of France and the French Revolution, and partisans of Britain. And these, you know, so if you want to ally with France, you tend to be the same kind of person who wants to think about a French constitution. And people aren't afraid to say at that time, the presidency is too powerful. Why do we have a Senate? You know, some of these things that we think are questions that date to the progressive era or today. I mean, they're all things people are saying in the 1790s. Conversely, if you want an alliance with Britain, and that's true of John Adams, roughly, Alexander Hamilton, you tend to be very interested in a British-style constitution. And if you're in the middle, like Thomas Jefferson, who, you know, typically plays things on the fence, then you're kind of splitting the difference between these two. But throughout the entire period I study, America is deeply international, deeply enmeshed in these kinds of debates. Lessons for today is much harder. I mean, the Genevan and Dutch revolutions, revolts fail, but, you know, they fail in part because they're invaded by outside powers. So I guess, you know, one thing to say is, well, try not to let that happen. But of course, you know, there's this interesting submerged theme in the talk that I gave today, which is something that, again, Richard Watmore, whose work I recommend very much, talks about a lot, which is that one of the things everyone is thinking about in this time with republics is small states versus large states. Now, you'll remember in Federalist 10, the key question is, can you have an extended republic? Which is just to say, can you have a big state, you know, geographically, maybe also with people, although America doesn't have that many people, but it's huge, which is also a republic? Or is that not possible because people can't ever get together to form a sovereign, you know, collective will, and the institutions of government would have to be too powerful and therefore imperial, and that would overset the republic? I mean, all of these classic arguments people have been having since, you know, since Rome, you know, effectively. So that's sort of one of the key questions, is this small republic, large republic thing. And, you know, I wonder if that's not a question of some continuing relevance today. That is to say, we do see that large, geographically extended, you know, in some cases kind of quasi-imperial states have more trouble hanging together as republics. On the other hand, you know, because there is a tendency to, you know, sort of become imperial. On the other hand, small states face a set of very serious and unique dangers. That is to say, invasion from outside forces, becoming the pawns of sort of great powers. And so, you know, that's also a principle. You know, I mean, these kinds of debates, I don't think we've superseded. I mean, I think very much continue today. I wish that I could say, well, there's an easy formula. John Adams just had it right with constitutional balance, or Franklin and Paine had it right with unicameralism, therefore America should get rid of its Senate. But, you know, but there's, of course, you know, history doesn't give us those kinds of lessons. I think the last thing I'll say is one thing we can pay attention to is the different goals that people have. I mean, if we understand the goal of Adams is a kind of, you know, we sometimes talk about Judith Schlar, a liberalism of fear. I mean, I think Adams has a kind of constitutionalism of fear. I mean, you just want to preserve a decent order, but Adams isn't interested in a glorious Machiavellian imperial republic, and he's not interested in sort of maximizing freedom or overturning all hierarchies or setting all kinds of people free. But other people do have those priorities. One who had those kinds of priorities is Brissot, who's obsessed with liberating other countries, with making France great so that it can free the entire world. And Brissot eventually wants to do so with French armies. And in fact, this is one of the key things underpinning his downfall. You know, he sends French armies to the Netherlands and to Belgium. The war doesn't go as well as he hoped. The general, who they placed all their hopes in, defects to the Austrian side. And that's kind of the end of the Girondins after that. So, you know, Robespierre comes to power. Effectively, one of his slogans is, "No one loves armed missionaries." Now, that doesn't mean that he believed that sincerely. It's kind of something he's saying in the scrum of political debate against his opponents. And, you know, France will continue various kinds of wars in 93, 94. Nevertheless, you know, I think that this is another question, you know, what a republic is for, whether it should just kind of endure in its own carapace or whether its mission is to go out and free other people, you know, is another kind of question that continues today. But, you know, now I'll say the boring scholarly thing that this period gives us more questions than answers, unfortunately.
Terrific. Well, I think we're going to end there. Thank you so much, Adam. This was really wonderful. Thank you also for your answers to the questions, and thank you to the audience for the excellent questions.